Chapter 3 Birds of a Feather. According to what Nancy's parents had told her about the school, the mandatory group therapy had been one of the big selling points. What better way to bring their teenage daughter back from whatever strange hole she'd crawled into than having her sit and talk to people who'd suffered similar traumas, all under the watchful eye of a trained professional. As she sank into the embrace of a thickly padded armchair, surrounded by teens who twitched, chewed their hair, or stared moodily off into space without speaking, she had to wonder what they would have thought of the reality. Then the 8-year-old walked into the room. She was dressed like a middle-aged librarian, wearing a pencil skirt and a white blouse, both of which were much too old for her. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, no-nonsense bun. The overall effect was of a child playing dress-up in her mother's closet. Nancy sat up straighter. The school's brochures had mentioned an age range of 12 to 19, allowing both the precocious and those who needed a little time to catch up to attend. It hadn't said anything about children under the age of 10. The girl stopped at the center of the room, turning to look at each of them in turn. One by one, the fidgeters became still. The hair chewers stopped chewing. Even Sumi, who'd been doing an elaborate cat's cradle with a piece of yarn, lowered her hands and sat quietly. The girl smiled. "For those of you who've been here for a while, welcome to the Wednesday night group. We're going to be sharing with the High Wicked visitors tonight, but as always, the discussion is open to all." Her voice matched her body. Her tone was older, cadenced like an adult woman's, rendered high and strange by her prepubescent vocal cords. She looked at Nancy as she continued. "For those of you who are new here, my name is Lundy, and I am a fully licensed therapist with a specialization in child psychology. I'm going to be helping you through your recovery process." Nancy stared. She couldn't think of anything else to do. As Lundy walked over to the one remaining chair, Cade leaned over and murmured, "She's one of us, only she went to a high-logic, high-wicked world where they kicked visitors out on their 18th birthdays. She didn't want to leave, so she asked one of the local apothecaries to help her. This was the result. Eternal childhood." "Not eternal, Mr. Bronson," said Lundy sharply. Cade sat up and settled back in his own chair, shrugging unapologetically. Lundy sighed. "You would have gotten this at your orientation, Miss, "Whitman," said Nancy. "Miss Whitman," said Lundy. "As I was saying, you would have gotten this at your orientation, but I'm not living out an eternal childhood. I'm aging in reverse, growing 1 week younger for every month that passes. I'll live a long, long time, longer maybe than I would have had I continued aging in the usual way, but they threw me out anyway because I had broken the rules. I'll never marry or have a family of my own, and my daughters will never find their way to the door that once led me to the Goblin Market. So I suppose I've learnt the danger of making importune bargains with the Fae, and can now serve as a warning to others. I am still, however, your therapist. It's amazing, the degrees you can get over the internet these days." "I'm sorry," whispered Nancy. Lundy waved a hand as she sat, dismissing Nancy's apology. "It's no matter, honestly. Everyone finds out eventually. Now, who wants to share first?" Nancy sat in silence as the other students talked. Not all of them. Slightly less than half seemed to have been to a world that fell on the wicked side of the compass, or maybe that was just the number who felt like sharing. Jill recited an impassioned paean to the moors and wind-racked hills of the world she'd gone to with her sister, while Jack only muttered something about burning windmills and the importance of fire safety in laboratory settings. A girl with hair the color of moonlight on wheat stared at her hands while she talked about boys made of glass, whose kisses had cut her lips, but whose hearts had been kind and true. The girl who was too beautiful to look at directly said something about Helen of Troy, and half the room laughed, but not because it was funny, because she was so beautiful that they wanted nothing more than they wanted her to like them. Cade made a brief, bitter speech about how wickedness and virtue were just labels and didn't mean anything. The world he'd been to was labeled virtue on all the maps, but it had still cast him out as soon as it realized what he was. Finally, silence fell, and Nancy realized everyone was looking at her. She shrank back in her seat. "I don't know if the place I went was wicked or not," she said. "It never seemed wicked to me. It always seemed kind, at the root of things. Yes, there were rules, and yes, there were punishments if you broke them, but they were never unfair, and the Lord of the Dead took good care of everyone who served in his halls. I don't think it was wicked at all." "How can you be sure, though?" asked Sumi, and her voice was gentle underneath her jeering tone. "You can't even say wicked right. Maybe it was evil to the core, filled with wiggling worms and bad stuff, and you couldn't see it." She slanted a glance toward Jill, almost as if she were checking the other girl's reaction. Jill, whose eyes were fixed on Nancy, didn't appear to notice. "You shouldn't close doors just because you don't like what's on the other side." "I know because I know," said Nancy doggedly. "I didn't go any place bad. I went home." "That's the thing people forget when they start talking about things in terms of good and evil," said Jack, turning to look at Lundy. She adjusted her glasses as she continued. "For us, the places we went were home. We didn't care if they were good or evil or neutral or what. We cared about the fact that for the first time, we didn't have to pretend to be something we weren't. We just got to be. That made all the difference in the world." "And on that note, I suppose we're done for the evening." Lundy stood. Nancy realized with a start that somewhere in the middle of the session, she'd started thinking of the little girl as an adult woman. It was the way she carried herself, too mature for the body she inhabited, too weary for the face she wore. "Thank you, everyone. Miss Whitman, I'll see you tomorrow morning for orientation. Everyone else, I'll see you tomorrow evening, when we'll be speaking to those who have traveled to the high logic worlds. Remember, only by learning about the journeys of others can we truly understand our own." "Oh, lovely," muttered Jack. "I do so love being in the hot seat 2 nights running." Lundy ignored her, walking calmly out of the room. As soon as she was gone, Eleanor appeared in the doorway, all smiles. "All right, my crumpets, it's time for good little girls and boys to go to bed," she said, and clapped her hands. "Off you go. Dream sweetly, try not to sleepwalk, and please don't wake me up at midnight trying to force a portal to manifest in the downstairs pantry. It isn't going to happen." The students rose and scattered, some moving off in pairs, others going alone. Sumi went out the window, and no one commented on her disappearance. Nancy walked back to her room, pleased to find it bathed in moonlight and filled with silence. She disrobed, garbed herself in a white nightgown from the pile Cade had given her, and stretched out on her bed, lying atop the covers. She closed her eyes, slowed her breathing, and slipped into sweet, motionless sleep, her first day done, and her future yet ahead of her. Orientation with Lundy the next morning was odd, to say the least. It was held in a small room that had been a study once, before it had been filled with blackboards and the smell of chalk dust. Lundy stood at the center of it all, one hand resting on a wheeled stepladder, which she moved from blackboard to blackboard as the need to climb up and point to some complicated diagram arose. The need seemed to arise with dismaying frequency. Nancy sat very still in the room's single chair, her head spinning as she struggled to keep up. Lundy's explanation of the cardinal directions of portals had been, if anything, less helpful than Jack's, and had involved a lot more diagrams, and some offhanded comments about minor directions like whimsy and wild. Nancy had bitten her tongue to keep from asking any questions. She was deeply afraid that Lundy would attempt to answer them, and then her head might actually explode. Finally, Lundy stopped and looked expectantly at Nancy. "Well?" she asked. "Do you have any questions, Miss Whitman?" About 1,000,000, and all of them wanted to be asked at once, even the ones she didn't want to ask at all. Nancy took a deep breath and started with what seemed to be the easiest. "Why are there so many more girls here than boys?" "Because boys will be boys is a self-fulfilling prophecy," said Lundy. "They're too loud, on the whole, to be easily misplaced or overlooked. When they disappear from the home, parents send search parties to dredge them out of swamps and drag them away from frog ponds. It's not innate, it's learned, but it protects them from the doors, keeps them safe at home. Call it irony if you like, but we spend so much time waiting for our boys to stray that they never have the opportunity. We notice the silence of men. We depend upon the silence of women." "Oh," said Nancy. It made sense in its terrible way. Most of the boys she'd known were noisy creatures, encouraged to be so by their parents and friends. Even when they were naturally quiet, they forced themselves to be loud, to avoid censure and mockery. How many of them could have slipped through an old wardrobe or into a rabbit's den and simply disappeared without sending up 1,000 alarms? They would have been found and dragged back home before they reached the first enchanted mirror or climbed the first forbidden tower. "We've always been open to male students. We just don't get many." Everyone seems to want to go back." Nancy paused, struggling with the question that was trying to form. Finally she asked, "How is it that everyone wants to go back?" "I thought people who went through this sort of thing mostly just wanted to go back to their old lives and forget that they'd ever known anything else." "This isn't the only school, of course," said Lundy. She smiled at Nancy's surprise. "What, you thought Miss West could sweep up every child who'd ever stumbled into a painting and discovered a magical world on the other side? It happens all over the world, you know. The language barriers alone would make it impossible, as would the expense. There are 2 schools in North America, this campus, and our sister school in Maine. That's where the students who hated their travels go, to learn how to move on, how to forget." "So we're here to do what?" asked Nancy. "Learn how to dwell? Eleanor dresses like she's still living on the other side of the mirror. Sumi is—" She didn't have the words for what Sumi was. She stopped speaking. "Sumi is a classic example of someone who embraced life in a high-nonsense world," said Lundy. "She can't be blamed for what it made of her, any more than you can be blamed for the way you seem to stop breathing when no one's looking at you. She's going to need a lot of work before she's ready to face the world outside again, and she has to want to do it. That's what determines which school is better for you, the wanting. You want to go back, and so you hold on to the habits you learned while you were traveling, because it's better than admitting the journey's over. We don't teach you how to dwell. We also don't teach you how to forget. We teach you how to move on." There was one more question that needed to be asked, a question bigger and more painful than all the questions before it. Nancy closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to sink into stillness. Then she opened them and asked, "How many of us have gone back?" Lundy sighed. "Every student I've given this orientation to has asked that question. The answer is, we don't know. Some people, like Eleanor, like me, go back over and over again before we wind up staying in one world or the other for good. Others only take one trip in their lives. If your parents choose to withdraw you, or if you choose to withdraw yourself, we'll have no way of knowing what becomes of you. I know of 3 students who have returned to the worlds they left behind. 2 were high logic, both fairylands. The 3rd was high nonsense. An underworld like the one you visited, although not the same, I'm afraid. That one was accessed by walking through a special mirror under the full moon. The girl we lost to that world was home for the holidays when the door opened for her a second time. Her mother broke the glass after she went through. We learned later that the mother had also been there. It was a generational portal, and had wanted to spare her daughter the pain of returning." "Oh," said Nancy, in a very small voice. "The chances are, Miss Whitman, that you'll live out your days in this world. You may tell people of your adventures when they're more distant, and when speaking of them hurts somewhat less. Many of our graduates have found that sort of sharing to be both cathartic and lucrative. People do so love a good fantasy." Lundy's expression was sorrowful, but kind, like that of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. "I won't stand here and say the door is closed forever, because there's no way of being sure. But I will tell you the odds were against you going in the first place, and that those same odds are against you now. They say lightning never strikes twice. Well, you're far more likely to be struck repeatedly by lightning than you are to find a second door." "Oh," said Nancy again. "I'm sorry." Then Lundy smiled, ridiculously bright. "Welcome to school, Miss Whitman. We hope that we can make you better." Part 2. With Your Looking-Glass Eyes. Chapter 4. Lightning to Kiss the Sky. The building was bigger than its population, filled with empty rooms and silent spaces, but all of them felt like they harbored the ghosts of the students who had tried, and failed, to find their way back to the worlds that had rejected them, and so Nancy fled to the outside. She hated to rush, but the sun burned so badly that she actually ran for the deepest copse of trees she could find, shielding her eyes with her arm. She flung herself into the welcome shade of the grove, blinking back tears brought on as much by the light as by her dismay. Setting her back to an ancient oak, she sank to the ground, buried her face against her knees, and settled into perfect stillness as she wept. "It's hard, isn't it?" The voice belonged to Jill, soft and wistful, and filled with painful understanding. Nancy raised her head. The gossamer blonde was perched on a tree root, her pale lavender gown arranged to drape just so around her slender frame, a parasol resting against her left shoulder and blocking the sun that filtered down through the branches. Her choker today was deep purple, the color of elderberry wine. "I'm sorry," said Nancy, wiping away her tears with slow swipes of her hand. I didn't know there was anyone here. It's the shadiest spot on the grounds. I'm impressed, actually. It took me weeks to find the place. Jill's smile was kind. I wasn't trying to say you should leave. I just meant, well, it's hard being here, surrounded by all these people who went to their pastel dream worlds full of sunshine and rainbows. They don't understand us. Said Nancy, glancing at Jill's pastel gown. Jill laughed. I don't wear these because I want to remember where I've been. I wear them because the master liked it when I dressed in pale colors. They showed the blood better. Isn't that why you wear white? Because your master liked to see you that way? Nancy stopped. He wasn't my master, he was my lord, and my teacher, and he loved me. I wear black and white because color is reserved for the Lady of Shadows and her entourage. I'd like to join them someday if I can prove myself, but until then I'm supposed to serve as a statue, and statues should blend in. Standing out is for people who've earned it. She touched the pomegranate ribbon in her hair, and one piece of color she had earned, before asking, You had a master? Yes. Jill's smile was bright enough to replace the blocked-away sun. He was good to me, gave me treats and trinkets, and told me I was beautiful, even when I wasn't feeling well. Jack spent all her time locked away with her precious doctor, learning things that weren't ladylike or appropriate in the least. But I stayed in the high towers with the master, and he taught me so many beautiful things, so many beautiful, wonderful things. I'm sorry you wound up back here, said Nancy. Jill's smile died. She flapped a hand like she was trying to wave Nancy's words away and said, This isn't forever. The master wanted to be rid of Jack. She didn't deserve what we had. So he arranged things so a door would open back to our world, and I stumbled and fell through after her. He'll find a way to open a door back to me, you'll see. She stood spinning her parasol. Excuse me, I have to go. Then she turned, not waiting for Nancy to say goodbye, and walked briskly away. And that, children, is why sometimes we don't let the Addams twins out into the general population, said a voice. Nancy looked up. Cade, who was seated on one of the tree's higher branches, waved sardonically down at her. Hello, Nancy out of Wonderland. If you were looking for a private place to cry, you chose poorly. I didn't think anyone would be out here, she said. Because back at home, the other kids were more likely to hide in their rooms than they were to go running for the outdoors, right? Cade closed his book. The trouble is, you're out of school for people who never learned how to make the logical choice. So we go running for the tallest trees and the deepest holes whenever we want to be alone, and since there's a limited number of those, we wind up spending a lot of time together. I take it from the crying that your orientation didn't go well. Let me guess. Lundy told you about lightning striking twice. Nancy nodded. She didn't speak. She no longer trusted her voice. She has a point, if your world kicked you out. It didn't kick me out, protested Nancy. She could still speak, after all, when she really needed to. I was sent back to learn something, that's all. I'm going back. Cade looked at her sympathetically and didn't contradict her. Prism is never taking me back, he said instead. That's not a non-starter, that's a never gonna happen. I violated their rules when I wasn't what they wanted me to be, and the people who run that particular circus are very picky about rules. But Eleanor went back a bunch of times. Her door's still open." Why? Nancy shook her head. Why did she stop? If her door is still open, why is she here, with us, and not there where she belongs? Cade swung his legs around so they were braced on the same side of the branch. Then he dropped down from the tree, landing easily in front of Nancy. He straightened, saying, "This was a long time ago, and her parents were still alive. She thought she could have it all, go back and forth, spend as much time as possible in her real home without breaking her father's heart. But she forgot that adults don't thrive in nonsense, even when they're raised to it. Every time she came back here, she got a little older, until one day she went back there, and it nearly broke her. Can you imagine what that must have been like? It would be like opening the door that was supposed to take you home and discovering you couldn't breathe the air anymore." "That sounds horrible," said Nancy. "I guess it was." Cade sank down to sit, cross-legged, across from her. "Of course, she'd already spent enough time in nonsense for it to have changed her. It slowed her aging. That's probably why she was able to keep going for as long as she did. Jack checked the record books the last time we had an excursion to town, and she found out Eleanor was almost 100. I always figured she was in her 60s. I asked her about it, and you know what she told me?" "What?" asked Nancy, fascinated and horrified at the same time. Had the underworld changed more than just her hair? Was she going to stay the same, immortal and unchanging, while everything around her withered and died? "She said she's just waiting to get senile like her mother and father did, because once her mind slips enough, she'll be able to tolerate the nonsense again. She's going to run this school until she forgets why she isn't going back, and then, when she does go back, she'll be able to stay." He shook his head. "I can't decide if it's genius or madness." "Maybe it's a little bit of both," said Nancy. "I'd do anything to go home." "Most of the students here would," said Cade bitterly. Nancy hesitated before she said, "Lundy said there was a sister school for people who didn't want to go back. People who wanted to forget. Why are you enrolled here instead of there? You might be happier." "But you see, I don't want to forget," said Cade. "I'm the loophole kid. I want to remember Prism more than anything. The way the air tasted, and the way the music sounded. Everyone played these funky pipes there, even little kids. Lessons started when you were like 2, and it was another way of communicating. You could have whole conversations without putting down your pipes. I grew up there, even if I wound up getting tossed out and forced to do it all over again. I figured out who I was there. I kissed a girl with hair the color of cabbages and eyes the color of moth wings, and she kissed me back, and it was wonderful. Just because I wouldn't go back if you paid me, that doesn't mean I want to forget a second of what happened to me. I wouldn't be who I am if I hadn't gone to Prism." "Oh," said Nancy. It made sense, of course. It was just an angle she hadn't considered. She shook her head. "This is all so much more complicated than I ever expected it to be." "Tell me about it, Princess." Cade stood, offering her his hand. "Come on, I'll walk you back to school." Nancy hesitated before reaching up and taking the offered hand, letting Cade pull her to her feet. "All right," she said. "You're pretty when you smile," said Cade as he led her out of the trees, back toward the main building. Nancy couldn't think of anything to say in response to that, and so she didn't say anything at all. Core classes were surprisingly dull, taught as they were by an assortment of adults who drove in from the town, Lundy, and Miss Eleanor herself. Nancy got the distinct feeling that someone had a chart showing exactly what was required by the state, and that they were all receiving the educational equivalent of a balanced meal. The electives were slightly better, including music, art, and something called A Traveler's History of the Great Compass, which Nancy guessed had something to do with the various portal worlds and their relations to one another. After hesitantly considering her options, she had signed up. Maybe something in the syllabus would tell her more about where her underworld fell. After reading the introductory chapters of her home-printed textbook, she was still confused. The most common directions were nonsense, usually paired with virtue, and logic, usually paired with wicked. Sumi's madhouse of a world was high nonsense. Cade's prism was high logic. With those as her touchstones, Nancy had decided that her underworld was likely to have been logic. It had consistent rules and expected them to be followed. But she couldn't see why it should really be considered wicked just because it was ruled by the Lord of the Dead. Virtue seemed more likely. Her first actual class was scheduled for 2 days' time. It was too long to wait. It was no time at all. By the end of her first day, she was exhausted, and her head felt like it had been stuffed well beyond any reasonable capacity, spinning with both mundane things like math and history, and with the ever-increasing vocabulary needed to talk to her fellow students. One, a shy girl with brown braids and thick glasses, had confessed that her world was at the nexus of 2 minor compass directions, being high rhyme and high linearity. Nancy hadn't known what to say to that, and so she hadn't said anything at all. Increasingly, that felt like the safest option she had. Sumi was sitting on her bed, braiding bits of bright ribbon into her hair, when Nancy slipped into the room. "Tired as a titmouse at a bacchanal, little ghosty?" she asked. "I don't know what you mean, so I'm going to assume you want to be taken at face value," said Nancy. "Yes, I am very tired. I'm going to bed." "Ellie Eleanor thought you might be tired," said Sumi. "New girls always are. She said you can skip group tonight, but you can't make a habit of it. Words are an important part of the healing process. Words, words, words." She wrinkled her nose. "She asked me to remember so many of them, and all in the order she gave, and all for you. You're not nonsense at all, are you, Ghosty? You wouldn't want so many words if you were." "I'm sorry," said Nancy. "I never said I was from a place like you went to visit." "Assumptions will be the death of all, and you're better than most of the roommates she's tried to give me. I'll keep you," said Sumi wearily. She stood, walking toward the door. "Sleep well, Ghosty. I'll see you in the morning." "Wait!" Nancy hadn't intended to speak. The word had simply escaped her lips like a runaway calf. The thought horrified her. Her stillness was eroding, and if she stayed in this dreadful, motile world too long, she would never be able to get it back again. Sumi turned to face her, cocking her head. "What do you want now?" "I just wanted to know... I was just wondering... How old are you?" "Oh." Sumi turned again, finishing her walk toward the door. Then, facing into the hall, she said, "Older than I look, younger than I ought to be. My skin is a riddle not to be solved, and even letting go of everything I love won't offer me the answer. My window is closing, if that's what you're asking. Every day I wake up a little more linear, a little less lost, and one day I'll be one of the women who says, 'I had the most charming dream,' and I'll mean it. Old enough to know what I'm losing in the process of being found. Is that what you wanted to know?" No," said Nancy.
"Too bad,"
said Sumi, and left the room. She closed the door behind herself. Nancy undressed alone, letting her clothes fall to the floor, until she stood naked in front of the room's single silver mirror. The electric light was harsh against her skin. She flipped the switch and smiled to see her reflection transmuted into the purest marble, becoming unyielding, unbending stone. She stood there, frozen, for almost an hour, before she finally felt like she could sleep, and slid, still naked, between her sheets. She woke to a room full of sunlight and the sound of screaming. Screams had not been uncommon in the halls of the dead. There was an art to decoding their meaning. Screams of pleasure, screams of pain, screams of sheer boredom in the face of an uncaring eternity. These were screams of panic and fear. Nancy rolled out of her bed in an instant, grabbing her nightgown from where it lay discarded at the foot of the bed and yanking it on over her head. She didn't feel like running into potential danger while completely exposed. She didn't feel like running anywhere, but the screams were still happening, and it seemed like the appropriate thing to do. Sumi's bed was empty. The thought that Sumi could be the screamer crossed Nancy's mind as she ran, but it was quickly dismissed. Sumi was not a screamer. Sumi was a reason for other people to scream. Half a dozen girls were clustered in the hallway, forming an unbreakable wall of flannel and silk. Nancy pushed her way into their midst and stopped, freezing in place. It was a stillness so absolute, so profound, that she would have been proud of herself under any other circumstances. As it was, this felt less like proper stillness, and more like the freeze of a rabbit when faced with the promise of a snake. Sumi was the cause of the screaming. That much was clear. She was slumped limply against the base of the wall, eyes closed. She wasn't breathing, and her hands, her clever, never-still hands, were gone, severed at the wrists. She would never tie another knot or weave another cat's cradle out of yarn. Someone had stolen that from her. Someone had stolen everything from her. "Oh," whispered Nancy, and the sound was like a stone dropped into a still pool, small but creating ripples that touched everything in their path. One of the girls whirled and ran, shouting for Miss Eleanor. Another began to sob, pressing her back to the wall and sinking down to the floor until she looked like a cruel parody of Sumi. Nancy thought about telling her to get up, and decided against it. What did she know of grief in the face of death? All the dead people she'd ever met had been perfectly pleasant, and not overly inconvenienced by the fact that they no longer had material bodies. Maybe Sumi would find her way to the underworld, and be able to tell the Lord of the Dead that Nancy was still trying to be sure, so that she could come back. He would be pleased, Nancy was sure, to hear that she was trying. Belatedly, Nancy realized that it might look suspicious, her roommate dying when she had just arrived from the underworld. Maybe they would assume she preferred the dead to the living, or that Eleanor's comments about them killing each other had been warnings. But since she hadn't touched Sumi, she decided not to worry about it. There were better things to worry about, like Eleanor, now hurrying along the hall, flanked by the girl who'd run to fetch her on one side, and by Lundy on the other. Lundy was wearing a grandmotherly flannel nightgown, with curlers in her hair. It should have looked ridiculous. Somehow, it just looked sad. The girls parted to let Eleanor through. She stopped a few feet from Sumi, pressing one hand over her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh, my poor girl," she murmured, kneeling to press her fingers to the side of Sumi's neck. It was just a formality. She had clearly been dead for quite some time. "Who did this to you? Who could have done this to you?" Nancy was somehow unsurprised when several of the girls turned to look at her. She was new, she had been touched by the dead. She didn't protest her innocence. She just held up her hands, showing them the pale, unblemished skin. There was no way she could have washed the blood away so completely in one of their shared bathrooms, not without being seen. Even in the middle of the night, the amount of scrubbing required to get the blood from under her fingernails would have attracted attention, and she would have been undone. "Leave poor Nancy alone. She didn't do this," said Eleanor. She wiped her eyes before offering her arm to Lundy, who helped her up. "No daughter of the underworld would kill someone who hadn't earned their place in those hallowed halls. Isn't that right, Nancy? She might be a murderess some day, but not on the basis of 2 days' acquaintance." Her tone was leaden with sorrow, but perfectly matter-of-fact at the same time, as if the idea that Nancy might some day start mowing her friends down like wheat was of no real concern. In the here and now, Nancy supposed that it wasn't. She watched dully as Lundy produced a sheet from somewhere. Linen closets, there had to be linen closets in a house this large, and covered Sumi's body. The blood from Sumi's stumps soaked through the fabric almost instantly, but it was still a little bit better than looking at the motionless girl with the ribbons in her hair. What happened? Nancy glanced to the side. Jack had appeared next to her, the collar of her shirt open and her bow tie hanging untied on the left. She looked unfinished. "If you don't know what happened, why are you here?" It occurred to Nancy that she didn't know where Jack's room was, and she amended, "Unless this is your hall." "No, Jill and I sleep in the basement. It's more comfortable for us, all things considered." She adjusted her glasses, squinting at the red blotches on the sheet. "That's blood. Who's under the sheet?" The girl with the brown braids from the rhyme and linearity world turned to glare at Jack. There was pure hatred in her gaze, enough that Nancy took an involuntary step backward. "Like you don't know, you murderer," she spat. "You did this, didn't you? This is just like what happened to Angela's guinea pig. You can't keep your hands or your scalpels to yourself." "I told you it was a cultural mix-up," said Jack. "The guinea pig was in a common area, and I thought it was supposed to be for anyone who wanted it." "It was a pet," snapped the girl. Jack shrugged helplessly. "I offered to put it back together. Angela declined." "New girl." The voice was Cade's. Nancy looked over to see him nodding toward her room. "Why don't you take that Adams and show her your room? I'll try to intercept the other one before she can show up and start trouble." "Anything to avoid another angry mob with torches," said Jack, seizing Nancy's hand. "Show me your room." It sounded like a command rather than a request. Nancy didn't argue. Under the circumstances, getting Jack out of sight and hence hopefully out of mind seemed much more important than forcing the other girl to ask nicely. She turned and hauled Jack to her door, still ajar after her hurried exit, and then inside. Jack let go of Nancy's hand as soon as they were inside, producing a handkerchief from her pocket and wiping her fingers. Her cheeks reddened when she saw Nancy's startled look. "Difficult as it may be to believe, none of us escaped our travels unscathed, not even me," she said. "I am perhaps a bit too aware of the natural world and its many wonders. A lot of those wonders would like nothing more than to melt the skin off your body. All those people in their creepy labs, hooking dead bodies up to funky wires. There's a reason they usually wear gloves." "I don't really understand what the world you traveled to was like," said Nancy. "Sumi's world was all about candy and not making any sense at all, and Cade went to a war or something. But the world you describe and the world Jill describes barely seem to match up. That's because the worlds we experienced barely seem to match up, despite being the same place," said Jack. "Our parents were, let's go with overbearing. The sort who always wanted to put things in boxes. I think they hated us being identical twins more than we did. But your names—" Jack shrugged broadly, tucking the handkerchief back into her pocket. "They weren't so upset that they were willing to pass up the chance to make our lives a living hell. Parents are special that way. For some reason, they'd expected fraternal twins, maybe even that holy grail of the instant nuclear family, a boy and a girl. Instead, they got us. Ever watch a pair of perfectionists try to decide which of their identical children is the smart one versus the pretty one? It would have been funny if our lives hadn't been the prize they were trying to win." Nancy frowned. "You look just like your sister. How could they think she was the pretty one instead of seeing that you were both lovely?" "Oh, Jill wasn't the pretty one. Jill got to be the smart one, with expectations and standards she was supposed to live up to. I was the pretty one." Jack's smile was quick, lopsided, and wry. "If we both asked for Lego, she got scientists and dinosaurs, and I got a flower shop. If we both asked for shoes, she got sneakers, and I got ballet flats. They never asked us, naturally. My hair was easier to brush one day when we were toddlers, probably because she had jam in hers, and bam, the roles were set. We couldn't get away from them. Until one day we opened an old trunk and found a set of stairs inside." Jack's voice had gone distant. Nancy held herself in perfect stillness, not speaking, barely daring to breathe. If she wanted to hear this story, she couldn't interrupt it. Something about the way Jack was glaring at the wall told her she was only going to get one chance. "We went down the mysterious stairs that couldn't possibly be there, of course. Who wouldn't go down an impossible staircase in the bottom of a trunk? We were 12. We were curious and angry with our parents and angry with each other." Jack tied her bow tie with quick, furious jerks. "We went down, and at the bottom there was a door, and on the door there was a sign. 2 words. Be sure." "Sure of what?" "We were 12. We weren't sure of anything. So we went through. We came out on this moor that seemed to go on forever, between the mountains and the angry sea, and that sky. I'd never seen so many stars before, or such a red, red moon. The door slammed shut behind us. We couldn't have gone back if we'd wanted to, and we didn't want to. We were 12. We were going to have an adventure if it killed us." "Did you?" asked Nancy. "Have an adventure, I mean?" "Sure," said Jack bleakly. "It didn't even kill us. Not permanently, anyway. But it changed everything. I finally got to be the smart one. Dr. Bleak taught me everything he knew about the human body, the ways of recombining and reanimating tissue. He said I was the best pupil he'd ever had, that I had incredibly talented hands." She looked at her fingers like she was seeing them for the first time. "Jill went in a different direction. The world we went to, it was feudal almost, divided into villages and moors and protectorates, with a master or mistress holding sway over each of them. Our master was a bloodsucker, centuries old, with a fondness for little girls, Not like that. Not in any sort of inappropriate way. Even Dr. Bleak was a child to him, and the master wasn't the sort of man who thought about children like that. But he did need blood to live. He made Jill a lot of promises. He told her she could be his daughter one day and rule alongside him. I guess that's why it was so important we be taken care of. When the villagers marched on the castle, he sent my sister to hide with me in the laboratory. Dr. Bleak said he said it was too dangerous for us to stay, and he opened a doorway. Neither of us wanted to go, but I understood the necessity. I promised I would stay a scientist no matter what else happened, and that one day I'd find a way back to him. Jill, he had to sedate her before she would go through. We found ourselves back in that old trunk, the lid half closed and the stairway gone. I've been looking for the formula to unlock the way back for the both of us ever since. "Oh," said Nancy in a hushed voice. Jack smiled that wry smile again. "Spending 5 years apprenticed to a mad scientist sort of changes your outlook on the world. I know Cade hates the fact that he had to go through puberty twice. He thinks it was unfair, and I guess for him it was. Gender dysphoria is a form of torture. But I wish we'd gotten the same deal. We were 12 when we went into that trunk. We were 17 when we came out. Maybe we would have been able to adapt to this stupid, colorful, narrow-minded world if we'd woken from a shared dream and had been thrown straight into middle school. Instead, we staggered down the stairs and found our parents having dinner with our 4-year-old brother, who'd been told for his entire life that we were dead. Not missing. That would have been messy. God forbid that we should ever make a mess." "How long have you been here?" asked Nancy. "Almost a year," said Jack. "Dearest Mommy and Daddy had us on the bus to boarding school within a month of our coming home. They couldn't stand to have us under the same roof as their precious boy, who didn't tell crazy stories about watching lightning snake down from the heavens and shock a beautiful corpse back into the land of the living." Her eyes went soft and dreamy. "I think the rules were different there. It was all about science, but the science was magical. It didn't care about whether something could be done. It was about whether it should be done, and the answer was always, always yes." There was a knock at the door. Nancy and Jack both turned to see Cade stick his head inside. "The crowd is mostly dissipated, but I have to ask, Jack, did you kill Sumi?" "I'm not offended that you'd suspect me, but I'm offended that you think I'd kill for a pair of hands," said Jack. She sniffed, squaring her shoulders. She looked suddenly imperious, and Nancy realized how much of Jack's superior attitude was just a put-on, something to keep the world a little more removed. "If I had killed Sumi, there would have been no body to find. I would have put every scrap of her to good use, and people would be wondering for years whether she'd finally managed to pry open the door that would take her back to Candyland. Alas, I didn't kill her." "She called it confection, not Candyland, but point taken." Cade stepped into the room. "Seraphina and L'Oreal have taken Jill someplace quiet while we wait for everyone to calm down. We're supposed to stay in our rooms and out of sight while Eleanor summons the city coroner." Nancy stiffened. "What's going to happen to us now?" she asked. "They're not going to send us away, are they?" She couldn't go back. Her parents loved her, there was no question of that, but their love was the sort that filled her suitcase with colors, and kept trying to set her up on dates with local boys. Their love wanted to fix her, and refused to see that she wasn't broken. "Eleanor's been here for a long time," said Cade. He shut the door. "Sumi was her ward, so there are no parents to involve, and the local authorities know what's what. They'll do their best to make sure this doesn't shut us down." "It would have been better had she not called at all," sniffed Jack. "An unreported death is just a disappearance in its Sunday clothes." "See, it's things like that that explain why you don't have many friends," said Cade. "But Sumi was among them," said Jack. She turned to look at Sumi's side of the room. "If she has no family, what are we supposed to do about her things?" "There's storage space in the attic," said Cade. "So we box them up," said Nancy firmly. "Where can we get some boxes?" "The basement," said Jack. "I'll go with you," said Cade. "Nancy, you stay here. If anyone asks, we'll be right back." "All right," said Nancy, and held herself perfectly still as the others walked away. There was nothing left to do but wait. There was peace in stillness, a serenity that couldn't be found anywhere else in this hot, fast, often terrible world. Nancy closed her eyes and breathed down into her toes, letting her stillness become the only thing that mattered. Flashes of Sumi kept breaking her concentration, making it difficult to keep her knees from shaking or her fingers from twitching. She forced the images away and kept breathing, looking for serenity. She still hadn't managed to find it when the others returned, the door banging open to Cade's declaration of, "We are ready to box the world." Nancy opened her eyes and turned toward him, somehow mustering a smile. "All right," she said. "Let's get to work." Sumi's things were as tangled and chaotic as Sumi had been. There was neither rhyme nor reason to the way they were piled around her bed and dresser. A pile of books on candy-making was tied together with a pair of training bras. A bouquet of roses, folded out of playing cards, was shoved under the bed, next to a frilly blue dress that didn't look like something Sumi would ever have worn, and a roast beef sandwich about a month past its Best Buy date. Jack, who had put on gloves before they got to work, disposed of all the soiled or biologically questionable material without complaint. Apparently her squeamishness extended only as far as her bare skin. Cade sorted through Sumi's clothing, folding it neatly before boxing it up. Nancy was fairly sure it would all wind up back in the big group wardrobe. She was okay with that. Sumi wouldn't mind other people wearing her clothes. She probably wouldn't have minded while she was alive. She certainly wasn't going to object now that she was dead. Nancy found herself tasked with handling the rest, the things that were neither trash nor fabric. She dug boxes of origami paper and embroidery floss from under the bed. Sumi had apparently always been good with her hands, and pushed them to one side, still digging. Her questing hands found a shoebox. She pulled it out and sat, removing the lid. Photos spilled onto the floor. Some showed Sumi as she'd been during their too-short acquaintance, mismatched clothing and tousled pigtails. Others showed a solemn, sad-eyed girl in a school uniform, sometimes holding a violin, other times empty-handed. It was plain, just from the still images, that this had been a girl who understood the virtue of being overlooked, of being a statue, but not because she had chosen stillness as Nancy had. It had been thrust upon her, until one day she'd discovered a door that could lead her to a world where she had a prayer of being happy. Nancy realized that Sumi's granddaughter was never going to visit the candy-corn farmer's grave, and it took everything she had not to weep for what had been irrevocably lost. Sumi might go to the halls of the dead, might even be happy there, but all the things she would have done among the living were gone now, rendered impossible when her heart stopped beating. Death was precious. That didn't change the fact that life was limited. Poor kid. Cade leaned over and took the picture from Nancy's motionless fingers, looking at it for a moment before he tucked it into his shirt. "Let's get this stuff out of here. You shouldn't have to look at it, not with her gone." "Thank you," said Nancy, more earnestly than she would have believed before she'd seen that picture. Sumi was over, and it wasn't fair. Working together, it took the three of them less than an hour to transfer all of Sumi's possessions to the attic, tucking the boxes away on unused shelves and in dusty corners, of which there seemed to be more than the usual number. When they were done, Jack removed her gloves and began meticulously wiping her fingers on a fresh handkerchief. Cade pulled the picture out of his shirt and tacked it up on a bulletin board, next to a picture of Sumi as Nancy had known her, all bright eyes and brighter smile, hands slightly blurred, as if she'd been photographed in motion. "I'll stay with you tonight if you don't mind," said Cade. "It doesn't seem safe for you to sleep in there alone." "I won't stay with you tonight, whether you mind or not," said Jack. "That room gets too much sun, and Jill has a tendency to sleepwalk when I'm not with her." "You shouldn't leave her alone," said Cade. "Watch yourself, okay? A lot of people are looking for someone to blame, and you're the best scapegoat in the school." "I always wanted to be best at something," said Jack philosophically. "Great," said Cade. "Now let's be best at getting to class before we get a lecture from Lundy on punctuality." They filed out of the attic. Nancy looked back at Sumi's pictures on the bulletin board, so quiet, so still. Then she turned off the light and closed the door.